Welcome, listener, in the shadows. We bring stories into the light. Join me as we explore the encounters no one speaks of and the things that watch from the dark. If you're still here after all that, you already know the kind of stories we tell. The kind that crawl under your skin, that echo in the quiet when the episode ends. If you want to carry a piece of that darkness with you, wear what haunts you. Our exclusive line of merch is made for listeners who feel more at home in the uncanny, the unspoken, the things that don't make sense in the daylight. Shirts, hoodies, and other gear, designed with that same atmosphere of dread, mystery, and whispered wrongness. Candles support the channel, feed the stories. You can grab yours at https://theshadowsprintify me, and as always, don't look behind you. The Slough Man, Bury Me Somewhere Drier, Chapter 1. The pipe mason Boudreaux knew the slough by smell long before he saw it. It wasn't just mud and fish rot. It was the kind of stink that carried memory. Stale rainwater trapped in black culverts, half-rotted cypress knees poking up like drowned knuckles, and something metallic that curled in the back of the throat. The drainage job was supposed to be routine. Pull a siphon pipe clear of debris so the parish wouldn't flood again come hurricane season. Mason had been doing work like this for 20 years, driving his rusted flatbed past miles of waterlogged cane fields, past the sagging porches of shotgun houses. He liked jobs in the middle of nowhere. No one watching, no one breathing down his neck. This pipe was wedged under a levee where the land dipped and collected everything the rain and the river didn't want. Branches, beer cans, bloated fish. A half-mile from the main road, swallowed in reeds and cypress shade. The air there was so still you could hear the mud bubble under your boots. He climbed down into the muck, knees sinking to mid-calf, and set his gloved hands to the mouth of the siphon. Most blockages came free with a heave and a curse. This one didn't. Something inside was caught tight. Mason reached in elbow deep, feeling for branches. His fingers closed on something hard, round, like driftwood. But it wasn't wood. It was a skull. He yanked his arm back, nearly falling into the water. The thing rolled out with the sluggishness of something reluctant to leave. Yellowed bone gleamed under the slime, and clumps of rotted weeds clung to it like hair. A second later, something else slid free, long, curved, jointed. A femur still wrapped in tatters of flesh like old rags, and the bone bled. Dark, thick drops welled from the pores, dripping into the water with little red blooms. Mason stared, thinking maybe it was swamp water stained by rust. But the smell hit him, copper and salt, fresh and hot, impossibly wrong for something that had clearly been under here longer than he'd been alive. A sound rose in the reeds behind him, not an animal, not whined. A slow, wet step followed by another. Mason turned, but there was nothing. Just the tall grass swaying in the breathless air. Still, the water around his boots shivered, as though something moved beneath it. And in the distance, so faint he could have imagined it, a voice bubbled up from the slough. "It's too wet here. Take me somewhere dry." Mason didn't realize he was still holding the skull until he dropped it. It hit the mud with a sound more like flesh than bone. He told himself he'd come back tomorrow to finish the job. But before the week was over, the slough would follow him home. Chapter 2, The Knock. The first night back, I slept with the window open. Not because it was hot, the winter air bit at my skin, dry and metallic, but because the house smelled wrong. It wasn't rot, exactly. More like the memory of something that had rotted here years ago, the ghost of a smell that had never truly left. The walls had always breathed like that in winter. You could smell the history in them, the dust in the beams, the damp earth rising from the crawl space. I told myself I'd clean tomorrow, air it all out, make the place mine again. But sometime past midnight the knock came. It wasn't the hard, urgent knock of a stranger. It was soft, measured, almost polite. 3 taps, then silence. I thought I'd imagined it. The wind does strange things out here. The old porch steps will groan if you breathe on them. Then it came again. 3 taps, the same rhythm, the same pause afterward. I padded barefoot through the hall, every floorboard remembering me with a creak. The moon was thin tonight, and the glass in the front door was too dark to see much through, just my own reflection, hollow-eyed and tense. I almost didn't open it. But in a moment that I'll regret for the rest of my life, I turned the lock. He was standing there. Ben. He wasn't wearing a coat, even though his breath should have been fogging the air. His shirt was one I hadn't seen since before the funeral. A faded yellow flannel, buttons mismatched, one sleeve cuff ripped, and he was smiling like nothing had happened. "Lena," he said, voice warm and steady. "I got lost." I couldn't speak. My throat closed, my chest burned. For a moment, I was 13 again, waiting for him to come back from a dare out in the canyon, furious and relieved when he finally strolled up the path. But something was wrong with the way he held himself. His arms didn't quite swing naturally. His weight didn't shift right, like he was remembering how to be in his own skin. And even though his lips moved with the words, I couldn't hear his breath between them. No inhale, no exhale. Just the sound of his voice, too clean, too exact. I let him in. Chapter 3. The weight of his voice, the first night in my old room. The silence felt heavier than it used to. The desert was never truly quiet. There's always the hum of crickets, the occasional cough of wind against the siding, or a dog barking somewhere down in the flats. But that night, everything seemed muffled, like someone had placed a hand over the land's mouth. I lay on my childhood bed, staring at the ceiling where the water stain still bloomed faintly above the fan. My mother had washed the sheets. They smelled like detergent and sun, but the room didn't smell right. It was missing the faint scent of sage she always kept burning in the evenings. She used to do it without thinking, like brushing her teeth. A slow waft of white smoke curling along the walls as she muttered prayers too soft to hear. But since Daniel's death, the little clay bowl she used for burning sat empty on the shelf. I tried to sleep. I counted sheep. I counted breaths. I counted the deep pauses between the creaks of the house settling. Somewhere in that count I heard it, a voice. Low, faint, like it had been carried from a long way off. But it was his voice. Not in a dream, not in memory. This was real. Keisha. My whole body went rigid. I sat up in bed, holding my breath, trying to locate the sound. It hadn't been a shout, more like a gentle call, the way he used to get my attention when he didn't want Mom to hear him scheming something. I glanced toward the window. Moonlight spilled across the yard, pale and cold, turning the yucca into bent shadows. I thought of what Aunt Marlene had said at the burial. Sometimes they're not ready to let go. Sometimes they come looking. My skin prickled, the kind of chill that seeps deep beneath the bone. The voice didn't come again. But I stayed awake for hours, watching that window, half expecting to see him standing out there. And the strange thing was, I didn't know if I'd be relieved or terrified if he actually appeared. Chapter 4. The footprints that followed the morning brought no relief. If anything, the light only made things worse. It stripped the forest of its protective shadows, leaving it raw and exposed. The snow had hardened overnight into a crust that broke under our boots with a sound that felt too loud. Every step echoed in the silence, as if the trees were listening. I didn't want to be the first to say it, but I could tell the others noticed it too. The wind was gone. The air was still. No drifting snow, no hiss through the branches, just breathless cold. We were moving slow, breaking trail along the ridgeline toward where the fire lookout said she'd last heard the voices. I thought I'd imagined it at first, but I kept catching it in the periphery of hearing, a faint hum, like the start of a word spoken under someone's breath. It was Larson who spotted the first one. "There," he whispered, crouching low and brushing snow aside. At first I thought he meant an animal print, but it was wrong. The shape was vaguely human, 5 distinct toes, a broad heel, but the proportions were stretched, the arch pulled long as if the foot had been dragged out somehow. And it was deep. Whatever left, it was heavy, far heavier than any person we knew. We followed them for maybe a quarter mile before I realized the pattern. The footprints weren't leading away from anywhere. They began in the middle of the forest, with no sign of approach. And then we noticed the other set, smaller, sharper, moving alongside the first in perfect synchrony. "Maybe hunters," Doss said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Hunters don't just appear in the snow," Larson muttered. The further we went, the more the tracks began to change. The toes lengthened, curling slightly. The stride grew wider until I realized with a sick drop in my gut that whatever it was had started walking on its toes. The trail ended abruptly in a clearing, not in the sense of fading, just stopping. The last two impressions were deep enough to suggest a leap, but there were no prints after. Nothing. We all stood there, breathing steam into the frozen air. And then I heard it, faint, from somewhere behind us. The sound of footsteps, not approaching, following. Chapter 5. The thing wearing his smile the next day broke with a pale, chalky light that seemed to take hours to seep into the house. Elara stood at the kitchen window, watching frost crawl over the edges of the glass. The air outside was brittle, still, too still. She had barely slept. Every time her eyelids drooped, she saw his face in the hallway. Eyes wrong, mouth wrong, yet so perfectly shaped into his features. It wasn't a nightmare. She had been awake for that. The smell hit her first, not rot, not blood, something old. As if soil from a grave had been tracked inside and left to breathe in the warmth. It was faint, just enough to make her stomach lurch. She didn't remember that scent being there yesterday. The floorboards creaked in the hallway. Elara turned, gripping the handle of the coffee mug so tightly her knuckles blanched. It was him, Jonah, standing in the doorway. Except he didn't step into the kitchen. He just stood there. His smile was stretched, just a fraction too wide, the kind of smile you held for a photograph you didn't want to take. His eyes scanned her face like a hunter deciding where to shoot. "Morning, sis," he said. Her bones felt cold. The voice was perfect, tone, rhythm, even the slight scratch at the end of certain words. But it was empty. Jonah's voice had always carried weight, warmth, a soul. This was an echo, a hollow thing that had learned the shape of him but not the substance. She forced herself to speak. "You're up early." The thing tilted its head, smile unwavering. "Couldn't sleep, wanted to watch the sun." The words came in a staggered pattern, as if they had been pulled from separate conversations and stitched together. It didn't blink. Elara's mind was racing. The elder's warnings had been clear. Don't look too long, don't speak its name, don't let it inside. But it was already inside. She had let it in. Jonah's shape moved to the table and sat down, hands folding neatly in front of him. The nails were just slightly too long, pale at the tips, almost translucent. It was still smiling. A gust of wind rattled the window. For just a fraction of a second, the smile faltered, and the skin at the corner of his mouth trembled as if it wasn't entirely attached. Elara's stomach knotted. She realized with a cold clarity that she wasn't looking at her brother. She was looking at something wearing him. Chapter 6. The fence line, the chain-link fence, rose out of the fog like the edge of a forgotten world. It was not tall enough to feel impenetrable, nor short enough to be harmless. Just the wrong kind of height, as if meant to slow you down rather than keep anything out. Rust had bloomed across its diamond-patterned skin, flaking in reddish scabs where rain had gnawed at it for years. Daniel stood a few feet back, hands in his coat pockets, his breath clouding in the cold air. The grass at his feet was brittle and pale, crunching faintly when he shifted his weight. He had followed the worn cattle path all the way out from the shed, past the toppled feed bins and the skeletal corn rows, until this barrier cut the land in two. It wasn't new. He could tell by the way weeds had grown up along its base, tangling through the lower links like veins through bone. But the top strand was wrong. Where it should have been capped with barbed wire, there was instead a twist of something like rope. Only when he looked closer, it wasn't rope at all, but hair. Long, coarse, sun-bleached hair knotted in uneven braids, wrapped tightly around the top of the fence. Some strands were dark and wet, sticking together like they'd been dragged through water. They trembled slightly in the breeze, and the sound they made was not the rustle of dry grass, but something softer, like fingers combing through wet fur. Daniel felt the weight of the fog pressing closer, as though it wanted to see what he was seeing. On the far side of the fence, the land dropped off steeply. He could make out the shadow of the gully, the dark slash of it cutting through the pasture. Somewhere deep inside that hollow came a noise, not quite animal, not quite wind. It was a slow, drawn-out groan, like an old barn beam under weight, punctuated by small, wet clicks. Every instinct in him said, "Don't lean closer," but his body didn't listen. His gloved fingers touched the chain link, and the metal was strangely warm. The sound stopped. The fog shifted in the gully, and he thought he saw movement, Not walking, not running, but folding and unfolding, as though something long and jointed was turning itself around. Whatever it was, it kept itself low, almost crawling, its pale back glinting faintly in the dim light. Then it straightened, and Daniel's stomach dropped. It was tall, too tall for the slope of the ground to explain, and its head tilted far too slowly, like it was learning the motion. The hair on its head was matted, hanging in ropes that matched the strands twisted along the fence line. It didn't come closer, but it didn't move away either. It just stood there with that awful, tilted patience, the fog dragging in thin ribbons around its legs. Daniel stepped back from the fence without meaning to. His heel caught on the stiff grass and he nearly fell. The thing in the gully remained still, watching, or maybe listening. He couldn't tell if it had eyes. Then, from somewhere behind him, a voice said softly, "Caleb!" He spun, but no one was there. When he turned back, the gully was empty. Only the fog remained. Chapter 7. The thing in the salt, it was O'Malley who saw it first. Or maybe he just admitted it first. The sky over the ridge had gone the color of cold steel, the kind that makes you think of hospitals and locked drawers. A winter sun clung to the horizon, but it wasn't putting out any heat, only light that seemed thin, brittle, like it could be snapped in half. We'd been walking for an hour, maybe more, following a line of churned up snow that led between the bodies, or what had once been bodies. Salt, all of them just salt. Figures hunched over, faces frozen in surprise or horror, mouths open, hands mid-motion like they'd been trying to shield themselves from something. When the wind caught them, a grain or two would skitter away, and I kept thinking about how many gusts it would take before there was nothing left but drift. We passed a man kneeling in the snow, clutching something small to his chest. A child, I realized, the salt formed tiny and slack in his arms. That one I couldn't look at for more than a second. "Hold," O'Malley said suddenly, raising his hand. His voice was low, almost swallowed by the wind. I scanned the ridge. Nothing moved. "What is it?" Kravchenko asked. "There." O'Malley pointed toward a copse of dead trees, their branches black against the snow. At first I thought he'd spotted another statue, but then the shape shifted, slowly, like a cat deciding whether or not to stand. It was hunched, elongated, one arm longer than the other, and even from this distance I could see the way its head tilted too far to the side, like its neck had too many joints. Then it stepped into the open, and I realized I could see right through parts of it. The air shimmered around the thing, as if it were walking inside a bubble of heat, distorting everything beyond it. But the shape itself was wrong. Patches of fur or hair across a frame that was mostly bare, skin pale and waxy where it showed, as though it had never seen sunlight. It paused, turning its head toward us in a way that made my stomach knot. It didn't look so much as feel its gaze. "Do not engage," Kravchenko said, voice tight. "Eyes forward, keep moving." We obeyed, but I could hear the crunch of snow behind us, not loud, just deliberate, matching our pace. At one point, I glanced over my shoulder. The thing had stopped again, standing among the salt statues. And I swear, God help me, it bent down, pressed its long fingers to one of the figures, and licked the salt from them. When it straightened, its head turned toward me in that awful, over-rotated way. My vision tunneled. I don't think I breathed for a full minute. We didn't stop again until camp. That night, the wind rose, rattling the tent fabric. Every so often, it would die completely, unnaturally sudden. And in the silence, I thought I could hear something moving just outside. Not walking, just shifting weight, like it was waiting for us to come out. Chapter 8, the second vanishing the salt fog never truly lifted that morning. It wasn't weather, not in the natural sense. The air was too still, the condensation too deliberate, as if every particle hung there under orders. We'd woken to find the truck windows clouded from the inside. The salt crust from the previous night's dew had thickened on the glass, blooming outward like frost patterns, except it was crystalline and grainy. I remember trying to wipe it away and finding the grains embedded in the glass, almost fused. When I rubbed harder, it made a faint squealing sound that reminded me of chewing on tinsel. McCree was gone before we realized it. We'd counted off at dawn, just a routine check, but by mid-morning he was nowhere. No tracks, no scuff marks in the ground, no sign of his kit. Even his bedroll looked like it had been unrolled just to be placed there empty, as though for display. The absence of struggle was worse than blood. Blood at least implies you might have fought. We spread out in pairs, weapons up, radios hissing with interference. The landscape offered no help. Grey salt plains, low scrub, and those damned statues, always at the edge of sight. The arrangement had shifted again. Now they were closer, almost in a loose semicircle around our camp. And something about them had changed. Last night, they'd been faceless, humanoid shapes in the vaguest sense. This morning, the contours were sharper, more human. Some even wore what looked like impressions of uniforms, captured mid-stride, as if they'd been frozen while running towards something. Alvarez swore one of them had McCree's jawline. None of us wanted to admit it, but we all saw it too. The fog thickened the farther we walked from camp, swallowing sound in a way that felt deliberate. I kept catching the faintest sense of movement just beyond my peripheral vision, slender, bent-limbed shapes weaving between the statues. Their gait was wrong, too fluid when it should have been stiff, too slow when it should have been quick. By noon, we regrouped empty-handed, nerves fraying. Nobody said it outright, but we'd stopped calling McCree missing. We'd started saying taken. And that was when someone walked back into camp. It was McCree, or at least that's what I thought at first. Same uniform, same build, same dirt pattern on the boots. But his movements were stiff, his eyes fixed a fraction too wide, and when I called his name, there was a beat too long before he answered. The voice was correct in tone, but wrong in rhythm. When he smiled, the skin around his mouth didn't crease. We didn't sleep that night. Chapter 9. The Slough Man stands at the door. The rain started just before midnight, not in a furious, violent burst, but in a slow and deliberate way, as if the sky was wringing itself out directly over Earl's roof. Each drop was a thick, heavy tap against the tin, and though Earl had spent his whole life in houses where rain was nothing more than a lullaby, tonight it only set his teeth on edge. It was the voice that woke him first. Not from a dream, not this time, but from the darkness of his bedroom. It was close enough that Earl felt the words in his chest before he registered them in his ears. "Too wet here," it said. The tone was calm, gentle almost. "Need somewhere drier." He didn't move, didn't dare. He lay flat, staring at the shadowed ceiling, counting the beats of his own pulse. When he finally shifted his eyes toward the bedroom door, he saw that it was open wider than he remembered leaving it. The hall beyond was nothing but darkness, except for the faint suggestion of movement. Slow, deliberate, the sound of water dripping onto the floorboards. "Earl," the voice said again, quieter this time, as though someone was bending low to his ear. "You promised." He thought of the siphon pipe, the way the bones had been wedged in there, slick with mud and blood that hadn't any right still being warm. He thought of the dream-swollen man with skin stretched over bone like soaked paper. He thought of how he'd woken 3 nights in a row with the taste of algae on his tongue. The floorboards in the hall creaked, heavy, sodden footsteps, and Earl's breath caught. Something passed by the doorway. He didn't see it fully, but he saw enough. A leg too thin to belong to any living man, water streaming from its shin and foot to patter onto the wood below. He reached for the lamp on his nightstand, but his hand froze midair when the sound came again. Not footsteps now, but the slow, dragging scrape of something wet being pulled along the wall outside his room. A smell followed it, brackish water, old fish, rotting cypress roots. The shadow moved again, slower this time, and Earl realized with sick certainty that it was circling back toward the door. That's when the gurgling started. Not in the pipes, not in the walls, in the hall, right outside his bedroom. It was the same sound the siphon pipe had made when it coughed up the bones, thick, bubbling, full of silt. Then came the hand. It appeared first as a wet silhouette curling around the doorframe. The fingers were long and pale, skin blistered from long submersion, the nails thick and brown as old wood. Water dripped steadily from each fingertip, darkening the floorboards. Earl bolted upright, heart pounding, but before he could speak, the voice came again, only now it was closer than it had ever been. "You pulled me out," it said, its tone no longer calm, but shuddering with something that felt like hunger. "Now put me where the earth is dry, or I'll sleep in your skin instead." The door began to creak open. Earl didn't wait to see the rest of it. He snatched the shotgun from beside his bed, stumbling toward the back door, every step a splash in the water pooling around his ankles. Somewhere deep in his mind, a part of him was still insisting that this was a dream it had to be. But the chill soaking through his pants, the smell in his nostrils, the drag of something following him through the hallway, all of it told him otherwise. The Slough Man had stepped out of the water, and he knew where Earl lived now. Chapter 10. The drowning room. The rain had started up again before dawn, soft at first, then relentless. It clattered against the rusted tin roof of Calvin's trailer like 1,000 restless fingertips. The air inside was so damp that his sheets felt clammy when he rolled out of bed, his bare feet touching the cold linoleum with a sound like suction, as if the floor didn't want to let him go. He hadn't dreamed of the Slough Man that night, at least, not that he remembered, but there was a heaviness in the air, a bloated stillness, as if the whole world had taken on water. Every corner of the trailer seemed dimmer, walls beaded with condensation. The windows, though closed, had water trickling down them in narrow rivulets, tracing the faint shapes of hands when he looked too long. When he opened the door, the ditch outside was already over its banks. Brown water surged through the grass, bringing with it plastic bottles, dead frogs, and a sodden clump of Spanish moss that seemed to writhe. The slough itself was hidden beyond the tree line, but the sound of it, that constant gurgle, like air being sucked through a throat, was unmistakable. Calvin knew he had to work. The rain didn't stop calls from coming in. Folks still needed their drains cleared, their pumps checked, their culverts dug out. But part of him, the part that had been whispering since the bones in the siphon, told him this wasn't a day for going near water. He ignored it. By mid-morning, he was hip-deep in a flooded crawl space under an abandoned shotgun house. The beams above him dripped cold water on his neck, and his boots squelched in muck. He was replacing a section of PVC when he heard it, slow, deliberate wading, just behind him in the dark. He turned sharply, his headlamp cutting through the low space. The beam hit waterlogged beams, drifting insulation, and nothing else. But the sound didn't stop. The water moved, as if parting around something that didn't want to be seen. Then came the voice, low, gravelly, strained, as if someone had been speaking underwater for too long. "You ain't done yet, boy. You promised me drier ground." Calvin's hands slipped on the pipe. He scanned the crawl space again, but now the beam of his headlamp caught something pale moving just beneath the water. Not drifting wood, not a pipe, a jawbone. The skull rose slowly, dripping black water and silt, sockets empty but fixed on him. A slick hand gripped the beam, knuckles swollen and split, water dripping from it in thick strands. Calvin scrambled back toward the opening, his boots catching in the muck. The thing didn't follow, not fully. It just stayed there, half submerged, head tilted, the way a gator might watch a wounded bird. Back in the daylight, Calvin sat in his truck, soaked and shaking. The rain streaked the windshield, distorting the world outside. He kept thinking about the voice, about the way it had said boy, about the weight in those empty sockets. Because for the first time, Calvin was certain the Slough Man knew him, not just his name. Him. Chapter 11. The last low tide, the sky broke into a bruised yellow before sunrise, a color that reminded Curtis of infection. A storm had passed overnight, leaving the air syrup-thick and smelling of torn weeds and rotting cattle. He'd woken in the small hours, hands clenched in his sheets, skin damp, not with sweat, but with the same cold, slick residue that had been clinging to him more often lately. He hadn't dreamed so much as waded through the night, moving in darkness where the moonlight was the color of diluted milk, with a voice behind him urging him onward. "Drier, Curtis, drier." The words had started as pleas. Now they sounded more like commands. Curtis pulled on his boots and a fresh shirt, the damp from the old bones still faintly staining the fabric no matter how much he washed it. The voice had grown louder since the night he'd seen the figure fully, its slick arms pushing itself from the shallows, the water hissing and popping as if boiling around its body. Since then, he'd avoided the slough after sundown, but the thing had adapted. It was clever. Now it came to him in the daytime, in reflections on water pooled in tire ruts, in the sway of willow shadows. even in the faint ripple of condensation running down a beer bottle. He knew what it wanted. He just didn't know where that place was. The old map in his truck cab was spread across the passenger seat, speckled with dried mud and the rings from coffee cups. He had circled every dry rise of land between the canal and the cypress stands. The problem was, the whole area was waterlogged, its bones and roots steeped in 100 years of floods. When he stepped outside, he caught sight of movement near the ditch, not in it, on it. The water's surface was bowed inward, like something was walking just beneath, its steps leaving slow, deliberate indentations. Curtis froze. The steps stopped. Something pale rose from the surface. Not fully, a face, or the ruin of one, its skin parchment thin and swelled in places, the eyes a dull grey like the sky before a thunderclap. The voice came again, wet as river silt. "You said you'd help me." Curtis's hands clenched at his sides. He remembered what the old Cajun Jack had told him weeks ago in the bait shop. Some things die where they shouldn't, and they'll never rest there. They'll keep leaking into the world till you put 'em where the ground don't remember water. But where in Louisiana could the ground forget water? By mid-morning, the figure was gone, but the gurgle remained, under the floorboards, in the drains, even in the wind moving through the reeds. The low tide was coming at sunset, one of the rare days the Slough's level would drop enough to reveal its buried bed. If he was going to do anything, it had to be then. Still, every time he thought of dragging those bones again, cold, pliant, and bleeding, he felt something rot inside him. It wasn't fear of the thing in the water. It was fear of what would happen if he failed. And the worst part, he wasn't entirely sure the bones wanted peace anymore. They might just want him. Chapter 12. The driest ground the morning he chose to do it was as grey and flat as a sheet of tin. The air was warm, but the warmth was the wrong kind, stale, pressing against the skin like the inside of a mouth. Charlie could feel it in his lungs when he breathed, as though the swamp was trying to claim more of him with every inhalation. The voice had not left him for 3 nights. It had been patient at first, a whisper from the water, polite as an old neighbor asking a favor. But now it was insistent, croaking, breaking. Not here, too wet, too cold. Move me. Charlie knew if he didn't answer, the Slough Man would come anyway. Not in dreams, not in gurgles, in person. He loaded the bones into the bed of his truck before the sun rose, wrapping them in the same blue tarp he'd once used for hauling timber. The tarp was already damp before he'd even tied it down. His fingers came away pink, and he didn't wipe them on his jeans, not because of politeness, but because he didn't want to see the streaks. The road to the high ground was nearly an hour north, a slow crawl through backwater roads where the swamp's black fingers reached under the asphalt, buckling it, cracking it, swallowing it. Every mile the voice grew louder, as if the tarp was just a thin layer of air between them. Halfway there, the gurgling began, faint at first, then sloshing, then the sound of something rolling in water right behind his seat. He didn't look in the mirror. The place he had chosen wasn't a cemetery. It wasn't holy, at least not officially. It was a long-forgotten ridge of sandy loam rising above the wetland, the kind of ground that didn't hold water long. Hunters had told him deer liked to bed down there. Dry enough, he thought, dry enough to stop the dreams. The air changed as soon as he stepped out. The swamp's stench loosened, replaced by something cleaner, pine sap, sun-warmed dirt. His boots sank an inch, not more. He untied the tarp. The bones lay tangled in themselves, stained with a pink that still glistened in the weak light. For the first time, Charlie realized they were not complete. Ribs were missing, an arm bone shortened as if chewed. The skull's jaw sagged at an unnatural angle. "You found the rest," he muttered under his breath, not even aware he'd spoken until the words left him. The voice came from inside the skull this time. "Finish it." He dug. It took hours. The sand was softer than swamp muck, but it gave way in long, sliding collapses. Sweat ran down into his eyes, stinging them until the whole world blurred. His hands blistered, tore, and kept working. When the hole was finally deep enough, he lowered the bones in. They made no sound, no clatter, just a soft, wet slump, as though they had always been waiting to rest in this spot. Charlie covered them, tamped the earth flat with his boots, and stood there breathing in the dry air until his chest no longer felt tight. The pines whispered above him. He turned to leave. The water was there. Not a puddle, not a trickle, but the entire slough, risen up from nowhere, swallowing the ridge in black water knee-deep and rising. The air turned heavy again, choking him. Something moved beneath the surface. Long, skeletal fingers breached the water, nails thick with swamp rot. A ribcage broke the surface, still dripping with pink water. The jaw opened. "Too late," the Slough Man said. "You brought it with you." The water surged. The pines vanished. The sand dissolved under Charlie's boots, and the current pulled him down. His last breath tasted like the swamp, bitter and old, filled with silt. When the water stilled, there was no sign he had ever been there, only the faintest gurgle in the roots of the pines, and the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps wading away into the dark. You made it back for now, but the things in the dark never truly leave, do they? They watch, they wait, and perhaps they remember you now too. If you want to hear more, if you dare to listen again, step back into the shadows. Like the video, subscribe, but know this: some doors once opened do not close so easily.